Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Report in Short.
This is Report in Short, the bite-sized podcast where we bring you the very latest in FPRI Eurasia Program scholarship. I'm your host, Aaron Schwartzbaum. On the docket for today, Russian women in the face of war against Ukraine. This was a great report about the multifaceted roles Russian women are playing in support of and against the ongoing war. Author Egla Murauskaite came by to tell us a little bit more about her research, so let's dive straight in. This is Report in Short. Egla, welcome to Report in Short. Great to have you with us this episode.
Hi, Aaron.
So let's jump straight into your report, which was a really fascinating read. Really encourage the listeners to take a look. Tell me about your motivation for this subject matter. What prompted your interest in the topic and this report specifically?
Well, it's quite interesting how the war between Russia and Ukraine tends to be covered in some pretty standardized narratives. So it was really interesting for me to look at the women's role there. And as the report does cover, it falls into the full spectrum, really. So on the one hand, it was interesting for me to look at the huge revival of women's activism in Russia. That was unexpected to me. And the deeper I dug, the more surprised I was. So it was really interesting, for example, to see women over 40, even women over 60, doing some arson acts and other sort of activities. Military families, mothers, wives, and partners of people serving in the army really taking to protest. So also it was very, very unexpected for me how, given this huge uprising of women's activism in Russia, and the interest of various foreign partners looking for interlocutors and new opposition leaders in Russia, how this trend of women's activism seems to be entirely missed abroad. There are very few women who are invited, activists or artists. Being politically outspoken is really hardly an option there. But people who do take to some kind of activism, how few of them are heard in international forum. That really was a major surprise. And then, of course, the other end of the spectrum, women's participation of atrocities. I'm sure everyone's heard of Bucha and how Russian war crimes and rapes, systematic use of sexual assault has been recognized as a consciously used tool of war. Of course, Russia is neither the first nor the last to use that, but the role of women there as perpetrators, I think, is something that gets overlooked. So again, it was really interesting for me personally to do a historical overview. What has been the trend in other centuries, in other continents, in other conflicts? And again, we see that there are very few exceptions. It's just that, women, once they enter the armed forces, they can and they do act just as brutally. So I would encourage everyone, not even necessarily following the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but generally interested in conflict studies as such, to use some of the reading references that I'm providing to widen the lens, to insert more complexity into the war narratives, be it, the Middle East, be it the historical review of wars that are of interest to them.
Let's turn to one of the pieces of your report that I found particularly fascinating, which is, of course, the role of women in Russian society historically. You provided a review of the way that's changed over time. And Russia is currently, I think, fair to say, a fairly patriarchal society, but that hasn't always been the case. There's been ebbs and flows. So could you walk me through some of the history, at least in the early Soviet Union through now, how that's changed?
Well, the changes have been in an odd direction, I must say. So, very briefly, as I cover in the report, during the Second World War, the share of women serving in the Soviet army was 10%. And now you can argue that in part that was, I guess, due to the emancipatory trends that really the situation of Russian women in the society, given all the left wing movements, was quite progressive compared to, say, other states of Europe at that time. But also, of course, due to the fact that Russia was experiencing dire shortages in manpower, massive numbers of Russian troops were being killed by the advanced German war technologies. So actually, yes, the number of women then was quite large serving in the armed forces. And of course, just statistically speaking, quite a few of them, just as their male counterparts, had been subjected to a variety of traumas, have also gotten both physical and mental injuries as a consequence of that war. Quite a few did heroic deeds. Some had been killed. However, once the Second World War had concluded, the Russian society basically closed down, clamped down really on women. There was no sort of portrayal of women as war heroes. A quarter of Russian men essentially were killed during that war. And of course, we understand that the ones to make it home were also pretty damaged goods. And really, the preferred modus operandi was for the society to go back, to attempt to go back to life as normal as possible. So, really, there was no space for women to speak about their traumas, about their war experiences, or to greet them as heroes. Like, that's in huge contrast to the war veterans that the males were getting treated as. I do some speculation in the report as to why that might be the case, but essentially, within less than a decade, the Soviet society, so we understand that it's not just Russia, but also the countries that they had occupied, had gone from fairly progressive compared to the rest of Europe to increasingly backward. So essentially, during the Stalinist repression times, the narrative was that, hey, we already have equality, right? So women already have the rights the same as men, whereas effectively what had happened was that they were doing double duty. They had to perform alongside their male colleagues at the workplace while also doing all the domestic chores and giving birth to children. There was really very little attention of how the domestic household duties could be split, what assistance women might need with childbearing and rearing, and that could be a whole separate report. But essentially, yeah, there was increasing backsliding, which only got worse with the election of Vladimir Putin. So, yeah, unfortunately, right now, that's also something that I cover in the report. The attitudes towards women in the society are quite backward, like comparable to the early 20th century European ones, like akin to ascribing hysteria to women and prohibiting certain professions as harmful to women. So really, when it comes to the military, it's actually quite a dire situation in there. Women are viewed as willing prostitutes for their colleagues, and they get physical and mental repressions when they refuse to perform sexual services. And even still, right now, as Russia is struggling to recruit additional troops to the front lines to fight Ukraine, it is only around 2% of women who are making it there, and in very sort of auxiliary support roles like cooks and nurses and the like.
So, in the current war, and your report covers the role of women in the war from the spectrum of people involved in the military itself, as you just mentioned, to more opposition roles. For the people actually in the military supporting the war, what kinds of work, besides what you just mentioned, what kinds of work are they performing? What roles are they serving in the military?
Well, as I said, it's mostly auxiliary roles, but really, so some women they come as volunteers, and actually, there are very few Russian women in the front lines, as confirmed by my contacts in Ukraine. That to encounter Russian women somewhere at the front, it's quite rare. However, as people get moved into Ukrainian territories as settlers or as officials to administer these territories, uh, encounters do happen where Russian women take active part in torturing Ukrainian prisoners of war, both men and women. So these stories do seem to be panning out. Also, interestingly enough, in Russia itself, there are quite a few women in the administrative apparatus, even though Russia is quite down in terms of the global scale of women's representation. They're really not doing so well. They're right about in the middle, so not at the bottom, but because they're such a huge state, that is a pretty downward turn. And so women's role in the administration, in keeping the war machine rolling, is something that is also, I think, quite frequently overlooked. If we consider the trials of the World War II and the classic ethical and moral question of how far removed do you have to be from the war machinery, from shooting the gun, to still be culpable for the acts that have been performed, I think this is something that hasn't been seriously considered yet, because again, in the administrative apparatus and particularly in the occupying territories, Russian women are quite active. And indeed, Ukrainians who are looking to hunt down collaborators or people advancing the Russian war efforts, they do get their contacts and they publicize them and they consider them just as culpable as the fighting soldiers.
Pivoting to the other side of the spectrum, women who have resisted the war in some capacity, do you have any particularly moving to you narratives or anecdotes that you uncovered in your research? I love providing that kind of color, something a little more tangible just for listeners in this context.
Well, to me, the artistic movements seem to be quite a nice illustration, like women doing impromptu, anonymous activities where they would leave toys colored in red dye as a reminder that Ukrainian children are being killed. But also, I think in terms of just interesting and also daunting realizations on both sides of the spectrum, because the data during the war is quite difficult to come by. A lot of the statistics that I was using for the report is about 10 years old. And when you look at information about attitudes towards feminism, attitudes towards women, women's role in society, men and women's attitudes towards what is a desirable outcome. In studies conducted in 2012, Russia and Ukraine seem to be starting from actually quite similar societal structural positions. That feminism was frowned upon, that women themselves wanted to distance, from this word, and 12 years later, the societies had taken very different paths. So in Ukraine, we see a lot of women serving as volunteers and entering the armed forces, and then again, it's interesting, that they still do face quite a bit of just physical discomforts. That early on, there are no shoes in their sizes, or it's difficult to get menstrual products in time. Particularly now, as the logistical lines of supply are often disturbed. But in Russia, the backsliding has been entrenched and has been quite difficult. So it is, you can cut this report and the data that I've worked into it in so many ways, just to, if you want a bigger picture of what these societies are undergoing, and not only these personal zoom-ins, but actually broader, longer-term trend understandings, I think it's quite usable in that way.
Egla, thank you for joining Report in Short.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Egla for her insights, and to you, listener, for joining. Don't forget to click and read the report in the description. This is Report in Short, brought to you by FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, visit fpri.org. We'll catch you on the next Report in Short.